Hi, Michael.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good.
Okay. Glad to hear that. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is The Wright Show. You are Michael Shermer, author of this book, The Moral Arc, How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. Not the American way, but freedom, which is the American way, so I guess it's all good. Before I introduce you further, let me apologize to people who are watching rather than listening on audio podcast for the fact that I resemble Vincent van Gogh today. Yesterday, my ear, like Van Gogh's, had an encounter with a knife. The difference is that I paid a surgeon to do it, whereas Van Gogh chose to do it himself. We'll see whether mine winds up better than his, but I'm optimistic. You're grimacing. Are you okay?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm just fiddling with my dog's collar here.
Oh, I thought the side of my ear had grossed you out. No?
It's all good.
Okay. Anyway, as I said, you're Michael Shermer. You are the founder and editor of the Skeptic magazine.
Yep.
And by way of further introduction, well, first of all, what are some other books you've written? Why People Believe, what's that one?
Weird Things.
Weird
that was
Things?
my first book, 1997, and that's still a perennial bestseller. A lot of professors use it in critical thinking classes. I did Why Darwin Matters, and I did The Mind of the Mark on evolutionary economics, and my last book, The Believing Brain, on patternicity and the tendency for people to believe anything that they see and hear, and how the brain works with regard to beliefs. And so The Moral Arc was something of an extension of my work in the sense that I'm mostly pro-science, pro-reason, and that this is the major driver of human progress in general. And of course, I've mainly been focused on the scientific revolution and all the things that it's brought us materially. So here I focus on morally, that is the moral sciences, and to what extent that moral progress is due to religion versus Enlightenment, secularist ideas, related to science and reason.
Okay, and to set the context, is it fair to identify you with the New Atheists? I mean, on the basis of your Twitter feed, I might be inclined to, but I don't think I've ever heard you identify yourself as a New Atheist. I mean, you're an atheist, but how do you sit in that context?
Oh, I don't know. Probably, I guess, I'm friends with all the, official card-carrying New Atheists, and there's really nothing new about them in terms of their beliefs or lack of beliefs. The central tenets of atheism have been around for centuries, really going back to Hume. And so what really makes it new is kind of the social media, the coming out campaign. It's more of an activist movement than an intellectual movement that makes it new.
Yeah, I mean, I would have said the missionary zeal is the way I would have put it, but and I think there is a real difference in the sense that there is the idea that you should convert people from religion to atheism. Whereas in the past, I mean, atheists were just kind of like, I'm an atheist, you're not, can't we get along, right? I mean, there's what's perceived as a kind of aggressiveness toward religion. And I mean, there's an actual tenet, which is that religion is a bad thing, which atheists don't have to believe. Atheists could believe that religion is a good thing, or they could believe it's kind of a neutral thing, or so in principle, that doesn't go with atheism. But the new atheists think religion is on balance a bad force in the world and needs to be.
Yes, that's true. And that is part of the part of that coming out campaign, modeling after the gay rights, same-sex marriage campaign of coming out, so that people know who we are, and they can see that we're rational, reasonable human beings and moral citizens of the United States, and and so forth, just like everybody else. Not everybody thinks religion is universally bad. I mean, it's not. Christopher Hitchens' title of his book, How Religion Poisons Everything. Well, it doesn't poison everything. That's empirically not true. It's more of a rhetorical device. To spark debate or whatever. But
so Hitchens used rhetorical devices. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
And we'll come to what you think the role of religion is in kind of moral evolution in the course of talking about this. Why don't we start out by getting clear on what you mean by moral progress? This book is an argument that there has been moral progress, especially lately. It's largely the result of scientific worldview, the Enlightenment, and so on. And in fact, you say we're living in the most moral time ever, or something like that. But what do you mean by this being the most moral time?
I mean, my moral starting point is the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. And so moral progress would just be improvement in the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. So I use survival and flourishing from an evolutionary perspective. That is, evolution vouchsafed us with the desire, the instinct to live, thrive, survive, and flourish. And then I use sentient beings, so that just to include animal rights in the discussion. That is, it's not just humans, but great apes, cetaceans, dolphins, whales, chimps, gorillas, and so on. And our intuitions have been expanding along those lines as well. And then I focus on the individual sentient beings, because it's individuals who perceive, emote. By sentient I mean perceive, emote, feel, suffer, experience, or conscious, being aware, self-aware. All those characteristics of sentience that cognitive neuroscientists have defined. I think applies not just to people, but to lots of mammals. And so any improvement in that, then I would say, marks moral progress. And so I track that, the expansion of the moral sphere over the last 2 centuries to include more and more people and now animals.
Okay, the reason I ask is because there's kind of some ambiguity in moral progress. I mean, some people might think you meant that the moral beliefs held by people are more enlightened than they've ever been.
Yes.
But that's not quite what you're saying. You're saying more, what you're almost saying is, by the lights of a utilitarian, things are, if your moral beliefs are those of a utilitarian who believes that the greatest, the greatest happiness of humankind, or you could add in other species, amounts to the greatest good, then by that standard, we're living in the best of times. But those are 2 very different claims, right?
So I guess I would agree with, both of those. I mean, a utilitarian calculus, you could easily say that not only more people, but a greater percentage of the world's population, has more civil liberties and civil rights, freedoms, autonomy, protection from abuse, discrimination, violent death, and so on than in any time in history. So that's a sort of an observational fact that just exists. And then the question is, well, why? Why did that happen? What's the driver of that?
Okay. So you're interested in the driver of both things. Why there have been more and more enlightened moral views held by people over time, and why, perhaps as a result, partly, there's more human flourishing and happiness and stuff.
Correct. Right. So all of our thinking has changed. Our brains have been rewired to consider people different from us. That is, expanding the moral sphere to include, outsiders. That is, our evolutionary tribe has gotten larger and larger. Of who constitutes an honorary in-group member that we should, have reciprocal altruism with and interact with, and positive sum games. That, as you argued in Nonzero, that has shifted, that has changed. It's just, pretty consistently, with a few setbacks, now and then, over the centuries and even millennia.
And Peter Singer argued that in The Expanding Circle before me.
Yeah.
And you mentioned his book. Now, Peter and I actually kind of put the explanatory emphasis in different places. So why don't you tell me how you explain this part of moral progress, that is to say, the expanding circle that's gotten us to a point where today you and I both believe that members of any ethnic group, religious group, national group are in principle worthy of respect and decent treatment and have basic rights and so on. What's your explanation for how we've reached this more cosmopolitan values system?
So I start really in the Enlightenment, that after the scientific revolution and the discovery by thinkers like Galileo and Newton that the universe is governed by natural laws that could be understood and even written out in equations. So the universe, the world, is knowable, and by rational beings we can manipulate it in a way that's positive to solve problems. So ever since Newton, social thinkers have patterned themselves after the scientific revolution, after Newton. Somebody like Thomas Hobbes, his great work, The Leviathan, is a thoroughgoing scientific treatise. He begins his work with particles in motion, atoms bumping into each other, and from there he builds simple ideas impinging on the senses to complex ideas, and before you know it, by the end of the book, he's got a defense of the monarchy and a structure of a civil society and what a Leviathan should be. Now, it doesn't matter whether we agree with his outcome and conclusion. The idea is that applying principles of science, scientific reasoning, to solving social problems, to explaining the social world, the economic world, the political world. Like the French physiocrats modeled the French economy, like William Harvey modeled the human body with the flow of blood through the body, the flow of currency through an economy. The French physiocrats in the Enlightenment made that argument. They said, look, diseases that impede the flow of blood in the body are like bad government policies that impede the flow of currency, of capital in an economy. And so we should regulate those or deregulate them or whatever. It doesn't matter what the conclusions are. But the idea that an economy, a political system, is governed by principles, and we can know those principles and understand them and then apply the principles to try to change things for the better, that's a secular, Enlightenment, science, reason-based system.
So you're saying we start approaching it empirically, we try different things and figure out what works and what doesn't work, and we keep making progress in terms of our social structures and our value system?
Right. So that's why Jefferson, for example, referred to the American experiment or the American experiment in democracy, or democracy is an experiment. You tweak the variables and you run it for a few years, collect the data, tweak the variables again, run it for a few more years. And those tweaking the variables are called elections. And so in a way, a democracy is like a scientific experiment. I mean, that's not a perfect analogy, but the idea is that nobody knows how to run a country. It's too complex, it's too large. So we have to have a way to constantly tweak it and change it, checks and balances and so on. And that's kind of a scientific way of thinking, that that we don't know the final answers. We can't project those. We can't calculate those. So we have to have sort of real-time updates and changes.
So you're not saying that anybody with a scientific worldview will be a tolerant, inclusive person. I mean, Hitler had a scientific worldview, right?
Yeah, no. Yeah, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that that a scientific perspective on solving social problems, not just the technology.
Well, actually, he probably would have said he had that.
Right. Well, yeah, but you see,
he just had different values.
Hitler and the Nazis were imbued with this sort of anti-Enlightenment romanticism. Blood and soil and race and genetics and all that was actually counter Enlightenment. That was that was in the 19th century. That was the Romanticism movement that was anti-Enlightenment. So if anything, Hitler and those guys were the opposite of what I'm arguing. And look what happened. So again, I'm not talking about the development of weapons or the atomic bomb or eugenics programs. I'm talking about what's behind it.
And you don't buy the explanation I emphasized in Nonzero, and I think was emphasized also by Adam Smith, that it has to do with the way the expanding circle I'm talking about has to do with the way technology allows us to play non-zero-sum games with people farther and farther away. So now we trade with Japan, and so like who wants to bomb them? And business people have fruitful interaction with people of other countries, races, and so on. So it doesn't make sense, and it isn't just a rational calculus. I mean, there are these sympathetic impulses that are natural to us that kick in when we perceive non-zero-sum opportunities. So you don't put much stock in that?
I do. I completely agree with that. Yeah. Now I have a section in the Moral Arc on economics and trade, free trade, as a rights expander, as a moral sphere expansion. That is, you're more valuable to me alive than dead. Or, Canada has a lot of nickel that we need for our electronics. It's the largest unguarded border in the world. We could just invade and take it. But it's a lot cheaper to just buy it. And they get our money and we get their nickel, or we trade with them and it's, less costly. And so people are more valuable alive than dead. And that also sort of retrains the brain to think of them as trading partners that we want to cooperate with in this positive sum exchange, rather than conquering, enslaving, killing, or so on, as our species was wont to do before.
And how then do you account for bursts of enlightened governance well before the scientific revolution? Like the Emperor Ashoka in India, he became a pacifist. He seems to have been opposed to the caste system that he inherited. He preached tolerance for all peoples and people of all religions and so on. How does that fit in?
Well, it can fit in fine. It's just does it hold? Are there other conditions? Because there's no one single factor like trade or democracy or book literacy, reading and literacy rates. There's no one factor. There's half a dozen to a dozen different factors that come together in such a way that it continues the momentum. And there's nothing inevitable about any of this. The whole thing could reverse. Not likely in certain areas. It's not likely that we would ever take the right to vote away from blacks and women, or that we would institute slavery anywhere in the world as a legal institution. Once you go fairly far down the road that way, the reversals are very unlikely. But if you go back far enough, yes, you can find examples like the one you just cited that didn't hold for very long, or they didn't take off and sustain for other reasons.
Although in China, I think, by the way, I don't think there's evidence that they ever had slavery in China, slavery as such. Mm-hmm. So maybe they just didn't discover it. They didn't realize you could do it or something. But I think that's a case where, for millennia, so far as we know, an unblemished record. Maybe I'm wrong. So, is one thing you're saying? You talk about a science of morality. Are you saying that there is a discoverable kind of one true morality, one true moral code? I haven't read Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, but I get the sense that was kind of the argument there. Is that what you're saying?
Well, actually, what Sam was arguing was that, no, there's not one moral peak. There's multiple moral peaks on the landscape. And some are better than others. Some are, way worse than others. But yes, we can discover those. We have already been doing this. This is what we've been doing, I argue, in my chapter on the Enlightenment, since the Enlightenment. The whole idea is then, let's see if we can improve the living conditions of humanity in all aspects. And, we're stumbling along, experimenting with different things and fine-tuning it. And so it'd be like saying, well, what's the one true democracy? Well, there isn't. There's, half a dozen different democracies. We practice a constitutional republic here in the United States. Great Britain has something slightly different. France and Germany different still. So there's no one right moral code, but there's certain moral principles that apply to most people in most places most of the time. And most societies have discovered those. Things like the Golden Rule have been rediscovered over and over because they work, not because they're inherently right in some ontological, metaphysical sense. It's that I use it by the fact that they work. It works better to expand the moral sphere, it leads to less violence and so forth. And this is why I abandon utilitarianism in certain areas. So it's by analogy, if you take like the trolley problem that everybody's familiar with, probably watching our show here, that the trolley's hurtling down the track is going to kill the 5 workers. Unless you flip the switch and it goes down the other track and kills the 1 worker, would you do it? Almost everybody says they would flip the switch. Simple moral calculation: kill 1 to save 5. So the problem with that, first of all, why can't you just find another solution? Like, get up. The train's coming. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is too easy to ratchet up from, kill 1 to save 5 to kill 1 million to save 5 million, or kill 10 million to save 50 million. We got to kill the 10 million Jews in Europe to save the 50 million pure Aryan, race. And that's the problem with utilitarianism. It's too easy to hijack into something else that's destructive. And that's why you need something deeper than utilitarianism, which is what I argue for: natural rights. That is, evolution vouchsafed us with the right to have the opportunity to survive and flourish. And why? Because that's the moral starting point. It's individual brains that are striving.
Wait. I'm going to have to stop you there. I think any philosophy professor would stop you there and not let you do that quite so quickly. You're saying we are endowed with moral rights. So yours is to some extent a rights-based moral system. And where do the rights come? Who gave us the rights? I mean, a lot of people believe that, say God did, and I get that if they believe in God. But to say natural selection did, it's like, well, why should we trust natural selection? Natural selection definitely gave us a lot of horrible stuff, and that you agree we shouldn't obey. So why would you look to that as a source of authority at all? Leave aside the question of what do you mean when you say natural selection vouchsafed us with something. Where do these rights come from?
Well, okay, so I'm just saying that whatever language you want to use, that we have an instinctive desire to survive and flourish, to reproduce, to find food and nourishment, to have a safe haven place to sleep. And if you're a social species, to have, a mate and a social group and so on. Those things are just part of our nature.
It's part of the nature of lions to want to kill us. Is that a good thing?
Yeah. Well, no. I'm not arguing that the way it is the way it ought to be in that sense. What I'm saying is that the way something is. We know that democracies are better than autocracies in terms of the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Therefore, we ought to promote democracy.
Okay, fine. But there you're using like a consequentialist utilitarian criterion for choosing among systems. You're saying this system is more utilitarian than the other because it leads to the flourishing happiness of more people, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But you seem to have separate from this a belief in some kind of rights-based morality, which is generally held as an alternative to a consequentialist morality. And that's the thing I'm interrogating you about. Where do those rights come from?
Right. So, but even something like, the lion is designed by natural selection to kill or whatever. Well, we're also designed by natural selection to have a propensity toward violence when it's necessary. So, like, where Dawkins starts off in The Selfish Gene by saying that the difference between kicking a rock and kicking another survival machine, another organism, is that the other survival machine might kick back. So our desire to fight back, to have revenge, to seek justice and vengeance to people that harm us, that is in itself part of our moral makeup. And therefore, the point of a civil society is to structure it in a way to incentivize people to not cheat on the rules, violate social contracts, to not encourage people to exploit one another, which leads to an increase in violence.
But we're actually designed by natural selection to do that too. In other words, yes, we're designed to say we want justice, to believe that good deeds should be rewarded, bad deeds should be punished. I agree that's an instinct. But we are equally designed, I think, to have a skewed, egocentric perspective of what justice is, and to be more attentive to slights against us than slights we commit against other people, and so on. So all of that is natural.
Yes.
I don't understand how you're deciding. I mean, it's one thing if you want to say, yeah, but only obeying this part of your instinct will get you to the utilitarian outcome of the greatest happiness. If that's your argument, fine. But it's not the end of your argument, and I don't understand why you're trusting human nature for some things but not others, unless you're using this utilitarian criterion.
I'm trusting it for the whole thing. That is, any moral system has to be grounded in an accurate theory of human nature that includes all of the aspects, good and bad, however you want to describe them, of our nature. Without that, you end up with utopian or dystopian societies that don't work because they're grounded in an incorrect theory of human nature. So once you know that, we have this propensity to want to free ride the system or cheat a little bit or gain a slight advantage over our fellow group members. But we also know that they know that we might be thinking that, and we know that they know that we know that they might be thinking that, and so on. Then we can design a social system to attenuate the one and accentuate the other. And this is the whole point.
How do we know that's a good social system, one that does that?
That's right. Yeah. So
no, I'm asking you, how do you know that that a social system that accomplishes that is a good social system?
Because it leads to the survival and flourishing
of more.
Okay,
so you're using utilitarian criterion. I just don't understand how this rights talk keeps creeping into your argument.
Because the utilitarianism can backfire. It can lead to the exploitation of large numbers of people. That is, body counts in history have racked up under that very kind of utilitarian calculus, like the Nazis. Okay. Or witch burning. The idea of what I call the witch theory of causality. If you believe women cavorting with demons in the middle of the night causes diseases and plagues and so forth, then it's a perfectly rational moral thing to do, to burn them and get rid of them or save their souls or whatever. But that's just a bad idea that science debunked. Okay. So we can gain a truer understanding of the way things really are in the world, so that we ought to then take that knowledge and change it to improve the survival and flourishing. Okay, so what about rights? So, but still, we are, the rights language creeps back in. Again, I don't care what language we use. It's a good language because we've been using it for 3 centuries. But just the fact of our human nature leads us to want to desire certain things and try to avoid other things, means we ought to structure society in a way that accentuates the one and attenuates the other.
Well, there is, by the way, utilitarian argument for rights-based language. There are two kinds of utilitarianism. There is act-based utilitarianism, where you say, well, if I stole this thing from the drugstore, would it, and passed it out to people who need it or something, would that, be good by utilitarian rights or bad? That's act-based utilitarianism. But you could also say, well, what if everyone does this as a rule? Steals from drugstores when they think it's right, and then you go, oh no, everything would fall apart. Well, that's a rule-based utilitarianism if that's the question you ask. Yes. So you can be a rule-based utilitarian and come to believe that the best rule to operate by is the rule of human rights, but that's still an argument. It's still a utilitarian argument where the rights language is derivative from utilitarianism. And I'm not. I just kind of think maybe that's what you're actually doing, but I'll shut up about this and give you the last word on this before we move on to something else.
Well, it's just, I don't care what the languages we use, and I'm not a philosopher, so I don't, in a long book, I hardly even use the words utilitarianism or rights or any of that stuff. What I talk about is, my analogy is public health. So when people ask, like, well, why should we want to have the survival and flourishing of more sentient beings? Well, we've already been doing this. We've all signed on to the idea that this is really a better thing to do. Public health is one analogy. If you agree that saving hundreds of millions of people using vaccines and sewer systems and all the things that have been in place for 2 centuries is a good thing, then you've already agreed with me that that this is a good thing. Why? Because more people surviving and living healthy, flourishing lives is better than them being diseased and starving and having, smallpox and so forth. And I can't imagine anybody would say, well, this is just a Western tradition. There are places in the world where people really prefer to live in filth and disease and are in miserable pain. Where is this? I mean, I'm claiming this is part of our nature to desire this, and we've already been doing this. The argument is over for 2 centuries, and I'm just identifying it, saying, let's just call it what it is. We've already breached the is-ought barrier long ago. We've been going down the road of attempting to save more people and have more people flourish. We've been doing this. Let's just keep doing it.
No, I agree. Pretty much everyone talks in utilitarian language, at least sometimes when they're arguing for things. The utilitarian premises are accepted by almost everyone if you pay close attention to the way they argue for things. They may have other premises that may sometimes clash with those, but I agree. So,
and the other thing on the utilitarian problem, again, same-sex gay rights and same-sex marriage. So lots of people still today feel like, well, this is bad for society. Okay, regardless of what the science says about can 2 gay guys raise a child as well as a straight couple, regardless of how that comes out, that the right to marry is already embedded in the Constitution. It's part of what we've decided is right people have. So gays should have the same rights, regardless of the utilitarian calculus.
Okay, on religion, we said we'd get back to that. You have a view about the relationship between religion and moral progress, and I think you certainly don't think religion should get much of any credit for moral progress, right? You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I acknowledge right off the front, page 1, Dr. Martin Luther King, the inspiration for my title, was a Baptist preacher, and, he led, much of the civil rights movement, and William Wilberforce helped the abolishment of slavery, and the Quakers and the Mennonites helped, lead some moral revolution. So let's give credit where credit is due. But for the most part, that's not how rights revolutions come about. There was no new revelation from God to any prophets that overrode all those instructions in the Old Testament about slavery. The Quakers, William Wilberforce, these guys were all using rights language kind of arguments. Equal treatment under the law. People should never be treated as a means to an end, but an end in and of themselves. That's Immanuel Kant. They were invoking arguments that were Enlightenment-type secular arguments, and then quoting biblical scripture. Moses said that we should be nice to the Egyptians because you were once a stranger in a strange land. You can find a few isolated passages in Holy Scripture that seems to support modern day concepts of rights. But for the most part, it's not there. And in any case, who were William Wilberforce's and the Quakers' primary opponents in trying to abolish slavery? It was their fellow Christians who totally justified slavery through biblical means and economic arguments, and that they were a lesser species and so on. Just it wasn't led by revolution. What happens, but by religion, what happens is that a small minority of people, sometimes the oppressed themselves, stand up and say, enough, we have to put a stop to this. And then a little momentum gets going. You need maybe 3%, 5% of the population if you have a lot of the intellectual leaders driving a rights revolution. And then more people start catching on. And then religions get on board. And they rally the troops better than most social organizations. They are good for that. And then they come around and drive it. So you can see this with the same-sex marriage revolution. All religions, with the exception of Episcopalians, secular Jews, have been opposed to same-sex marriage.
Unitarians. Don't forget the Unitarians, yes. Michael.
If you count that as a religion, then yes, the Unitarians. Absolutely.
They do, I think.
But we've seen from the Pew polls all the way up till last year, the major opponents of same-sex marriage and gay rights have been, evangelicals, Protestants and Baptists, Catholics. It's all the mainstream religions. And what will happen is they will all get on board. Once the Supreme Court votes in June, all 50 states will allow gay marriage, and within 5 years, the majority of Americans will agree it's perfectly fine. And then religions will say, God loves everybody, including gays. And look here, Jesus said, we should all love one another. And they'll find some biblical passages and they'll take credit, for the same-sex marriage. But just remember, we're in the middle of it right now in 2015, and we can see who's opposing it. And that's a very common, way that rights revolutions have unfolded in the past. So
yeah, of course, I mean, you could probably describe it in terms of other variables. You could probably, if you looked at income, level of education, blah, 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 you could probably do a pretty good job of predicting, rural versus urban residents. You could probably do a pretty good job of predicting who is going to oppose gay marriage. As it happens, those things also correlate with religion, and I think it would be an open question which is the causal force.
Yes, it's a social science problem, certainly, but that isn't what people say. The people who object to it make religious arguments.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But that doesn't. But the argument, my argument would be, at least that I'm making conjecturally, that okay, but if you look at people in that demographic who aren't religious, they just make a different argument. People always make whatever argument's handy.
Yes.
Whether or not the values system that the argument is drawn from is actually the motivating force.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe.
Now you say that religion is xenophobic and tribal by nature. Is it more so? I mean, compared to what? Compared to nation states? I mean, is it more so than all kinds of other human social structures?
Well, I would say humans have the propensity to be tribal, regardless of what's behind it. Ideology, Marxism or nation states or religion, color of skin, whatever. There's all sorts of ways that our brains are designed to go down those paths. But religion has been historically one of those that has, made things more tribal. You can see that today with, the biggest problem that we face with terrorist violence is Islam. Certain branches of Islam that, Sharia that emphasize certain kinds of Sharia law. Those are very tribal in nature.
Right. Although again, that's a case where if you looked at variables like, education, was your country invaded by America? There's other is it being occupied, by a different ethnic group, whereas you think you're entitled to, I mean, there's other variables, that are relevant here. It's certainly true. I certainly think for sure that religion, by being an ethnic marker, right, by being one of the ways, the criteria by which you can say, yeah, I'm in your group, it can contribute to violence. So can the language you speak and the color of your skin and the nation you're a member of. I'm not convinced that it's any more conducive to violence than any of those other social markers.
Yes, that's right. But I'm saying historically what has actually happened. It's true that, say revolutionary Marxism has certainly tallied up big body counts. But in a way, it's the same argument that because Marxism is a kind of a faux religion. It's the kind of thing religions do, of hijacking brains to get people to do things. And but what I'm just arguing simply, when the Charlie Hebdo assassins marched in there and screamed Allah Akbar, and we have revenged our prophet, I think we should take them at their word. That's why they did it. That's their motivations. I don't think it has, they're not in there saying we're oppressed and we're sick of American troops. And
they always say that. Actually, they always say that, Michael. Look at what the jihadists, the so-called jihadists, actually say, and they're virtually always the Boston marathon bombers, the guy who planned 9/11. They virtually always cite a grievance. Now, you can say that's a lie. It's really they're just reading the Quran, but you can't claim that they don't have grievances they cite.
Oh, no,
that's just not true.
Yeah, no, of course, I agree. I know. I'm aware of, like Scott Atran's tracking of the things that these, terrorist cells talk about. I understand there are multiple motives. But we're talking about religion in particular. We talk about economics and income inequality or whatever. Yes, those are all factors and variables that come into play. But religion is one of them, and it's a powerful one.
It seems to me that's an open question. Whether I mean, there certainly are things that are relevant. If you believe you'll go to heaven when you die, that can lead you to to take more risks, especially if you believe that you'll go to heaven for killing certain kinds of people. I think that's true. It's
one of the things that makes the old Cold War strategy of mutual assured destruction as a game theory strategy worked with with atheists, with the Soviets, who we just assumed wanted to live. That strategy is not going to work with somebody who is looking forward to death, and they wouldn't be without their religion. So that's one example of the power of religion.
Yeah, although I mean, we don't need to get into the tactics of the war on terror. The people who lead, the terrorist leaders, they don't want to die. They're not the guys who volunteer for the suicide missions.
Yes, of course, right. Yeah.
So it really, anyway. I guess I have to ask you about this thing that happened just today that we're taping in this context, okay? So these 3 Muslims were killed in North Carolina. You've heard about this probably.
Right.
They were killed by a guy who, I guess broadly speaking, you could say he would probably have identified himself with the new atheist movement. He belonged to certain organizations. He was always saying religion was horrible and blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, you and I both agree he's not representative of your typical new atheist. And we should say we don't know for sure what his motivation was. I mean, he lived in the same building as these people, and nominally, there was some dispute they had going. I suspect it's a pretty good bet that had they been 3 people with Sam Harris books on their shelves instead of 3 Muslims, I'm guessing he wouldn't have killed them. But we don't know for sure. But if you accept if we just stipulate that, okay, maybe he was motivated by his hatred of religion and maybe of Muslims in particular, I mean, does that say something about the fact that belligerent tribalism can be part of anything that identifies itself as a group, as a movement, right?
Yes, it can, of course. But 2 things. One, atheism isn't even a thing. I mean, it's not like a central, an organization with a set of central tenets or dogmas, or like humanism. The secular humanists, they have a document that these are the 37 things we believe. There's nothing like that for atheism. So whatever his motives are, it can't be I killed them because I'm an atheist. It would be I killed them because I don't like their religion. Well, that's a different motive than atheism. So being anti-religious could itself be a motivator, but that's not atheism per se.
Right, but the new atheism, it may not have a code of conduct or set of formal tenets. It is kind of a movement. I mean, the new atheists are identifiable. They worship, if you'll pardon the metaphor, Sam Harris, and they do believe religion's a bad thing. The world will be better if we can, get rid of it, and so there are beliefs that identify this as a movement, right? New atheism,
sure,
I mean.
Sure. But of course, we would condemn it because committing violence as a means of social change is always wrong. Yeah. Unless you're just fighting back someone like ISIL, then you have to use violence sometimes to thwart violence. But otherwise, and I'll say the same thing in defense of Christians. Christians used to behead Jews and burn women. just like ISIL did before they went through the Enlightenment, and they don't do that anymore. I mean, when's the last abortion clinic bombing? I mean, people always throw that out. I can't even remember when it was, like early 90s, I think. This stuff just doesn't, it's almost non-existent, although you can find a few isolated examples. So the atheist guy, whatever his motives were, he kills 3 Muslims, they would be in that same category of the abortion clinic bombers. It's just so rare. It's nothing like the daily news reports we get on Islamic terrorism.
Mm-hmm. And one more question related to New Atheism. I mean, your book is about moral progress. To me, part of being a moral person, in my sense of the word, is to not gratuitously insult people. I mean, sometimes you have to say things that people are going to take offense at, and there are good reasons to think they need to be said. But I don't think people should be gratuitously insulted for no good reason. Certainly not by saying something that's not in fact true. So I'm just curious, when Sam Harris says something like Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas, which just seems to me an absurd thing to say. I mean, the mother lode, like worse than Nazism. I mean, that seems to me to make no sense. It definitely offends people. It seems to me almost designed to offend them, but that may or may not be the case. Do you think that's like a good thing to do?
Well, there's different strategies that work for different people. That's not my strategy. A lot of people love Sam and Richard Dawkins and for doing that kind of thing, and a lot of people don't. So, I think there's different approaches. There's not one right way to deal with the problems of religion. Mother lode of ideas. You'd have to ask Sam what he meant. I think what he meant was that there's enough bad ideas, say, embedded in Sharia law and in the Quran, that those who wish to pick and choose and commit violence in the name of those certain passages or whatever are, that's a problem. And we should identify them no less than we did, identifying that burning women as witches is an idiotic idea. I mean, that's just a screwball idea. Or that Jews poisoned wells and caused the Black Death. I mean, that was a stupid idea that led to a lot of violence. And we don't do that anymore. We don't even think along those lines anymore. That Jews are doing this, or blacks are doing that, or women are inferior, or whatever. Our minds don't go there anymore.
Yeah, although I could argue that to say Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas is almost factually wrong in the same sense. In that, first of all, if you have any kind of sophisticated understanding of religion, you know that you can't really begin a sentence, Islam is or Christianity is anything virtually, because the manifestations of any given religion are so diverse. And they always depend on interpretation of scriptures, selective citation of scripture, and in any event, a statement that extreme, the mother lode has a meaning. It's the source. The mother lode of bad ideas. He didn't qualify that. He didn't say he didn't even say of bad religions, just of bad ideas. Now that's kind of crazy. So I mean, maybe what I'd ask you is, you're somewhat utilitarian at least. If it could be argued that saying something that is first of all untrue, which I think that was, is going to lead to bad outcomes because it's just going to needlessly insult people and have the opposite of the effect you want, and maybe even lead to more terrorism. When that's the case, would you say that's like a bad thing to say?
I think in general, as a general principle, that the more we can employ reason and science to even our strategies, that is to gain the best outcomes, that is my approach. So in this particular case, for example, I'm critical of whatever ideas that people hold, not the people themselves, or even which parts of a religion are the problem, not the religion itself. It's too broad to say religion's the problem. It's like my libertarian friends that say all governments are bad. Well, no, actually some are way worse than others. Some are way better than others. Most religions, I'm not worried about, like the Jains, for example. So you can't even say religious extremists are the problem. Jains are religious extremists. I mean, they're way out there on their, animal rights views, for example. They won't even kill insects. But I'm not worried about, extremist Jains coming to my offices to, bomb the offices of Skeptic magazine. That they're not going to do that. So it's not. So it's not.
Maybe if we invade their country, they could be persuaded to do that. I don't think we've ever done that. But anyway,
so, in other words, so it's not religion's not the problem. Religious extremists not the problem. It's religious extremist violence based in bad ideas. Bad ideas like like we used to hold, that Jews poison wells, that women cavort with demons and are witches. So we've debunked all those. We have to continue debunking supernatural ideas. If you believe the creator of the universe wrote a book and handed down these laws and you absolutely believe it, that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for violence, because why would you tolerate somebody who doesn't agree with you if you really believe those are absolute moral values? That's what the problem is.
You believe in absolute moral values, don't you? I'm not saying you would kill over them, but I'm arguing that in fact you don't have to kill over absolute moral, because you believe in actual moral truths, don't you?
I do. So, but again, it's like 4 or 5 factors that tied to that, and the desire to kill somebody or violently try to impose social change based on those beliefs. That's the problem. In a democracy, you fight for your ideas in the marketplace of ideas, and if you lose, too bad. You have to wait till the next election. And it's not that the politicians in Washington are any less emotional about it. They just can't act on it violently. They just can't. It's not allowed. They don't even go down that road. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, they just wait till the next election and campaign and raise more money or whatever. That's what we've done. We've become more civilized in that sense.
Right. All this reminds me of a point I want to make about the malleability of religion in defense of the Old Testament. One thing you said in the book is like, in the Bible, there's like no love for the Moabites, by way of emphasizing that, the idea is, I guess, that the Israelites it's all about the Israelites, right? I mean, it's their Bible.
Yeah.
I would say, though, look at the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is about the discovery, I think, that, in effect, that the great-grandmother of King David was a Moabite, Ruth. And I think that's it. Anyway, the common thinking is that, well, one strand of thought is, this is like a document of ethnic inclusion. For whatever reason, when this was written, and it may well have been that it was written after the exile, when Israel was part of the Persian Empire along with the Moabites, okay, then there was like a non-zero-sum relationship with them, and so suddenly there were grounds for tolerance. And similarly, in the book of Jonah, God says you should be compassionate toward the Ninevites, who were Syrians, and God knows they had their issues with the Israelites. The point is, even in the Old Testament, it seems to me we see religion responding to changing political relationships in a way that can actually make it less tribalistic. You see the same thing in the Quran, by the way, in terms of the variation in things that are said about Christians and Jews. One minute we love them, next minute we don't.
Right. So the evolutionary perspective on that is, who love thy neighbor. Well, who constitutes thy neighbor?
Right.
So in some sense, it's just your immediate tribe. In other sense, like in the book of Ruth, but the book of Ruth, if I recall, was written later, and it's a little more of a feminist, inclusive, what we would call liberal, classical liberal, social liberal, whatever attitudes that were incongruous with the rest of the books of the Old Testament. So, well, good. Then let's encourage religious people to follow that rather than the nastier parts.
But I don't think it's just that it's later in the sense that there was some linear arc of progress. It just so happens in this case later was a time when they had a non-zero-sum relationship with the Moabites. That I'm sure that changed later.
And isn't that is sort of what I'm arguing, that whatever it is that leads groups to be more non-zero in their non-zero in their exchanges than. No, sorry, I said that wrong.
Yeah, interdependence and non-zero-sum relations breed mutual tolerance.
Yeah. So anything that does that is good. So you just identified one of the factors, trade, exchanges.
Yeah, but my point is that religion is as responsive to those dynamics as politics. It's just my argument again that I don't think religion is intrinsically more tribalistic than nationalism. Both often are. But it depends on the situation.
Well, but historically, they had a longer stretch of time doing that. And certainly, if you have supernatural beliefs about morality and the deity, then that's going to lead to stronger held beliefs.
Maybe.
I wouldn't argue that, say, revolutionary Marxists in the 70s were any less emotional or committed to their beliefs when they committed violence. Not at all. It can be hijacked in many different ways. Okay. But historically, religion has been at it a lot longer.
Okay. I've got to ask you about, you mentioned that the title of your book, The Moral Arc, comes from a famous phrase by Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. you're arguing that there has been moral progress. I'm kind of guessing that if Martin Luther King were around today, he would look at the degree of income inequality and say, and the fact that it's growing, and maybe by his lights, of course this depends on your definition of justice, but he might well say, actually things are getting less just, and income inequality is growing. How would that fit into your view?
Well, income inequality is just one factor. Not everybody agrees that's moral regress. The fact is that the top quintile have gotten richer faster than the other 4 quintile, but the other 4 quintile have also all gotten richer in absolute measures controlled for, adjusted for inflation and so on since the 70s. I mean, real income has risen for everybody. So hopefully somebody like King would say, we have made a lot of progress and this is great. We still have more to go. But what does that actually mean? I mean, pulling higher taxes for higher income brackets. I mean, if you look at the United States' rate, it's pretty close, for the highest taxation of the highest income brackets to all the European countries, UK as well. It's not that out of line. So it just depends on what you think income inequality leads to. I mean, do people really commit more crimes when there's more income inequality? I don't think the correlational data shows that.
No, I mean, there is evidence that people judge, the people's well-being depends partly on their perception of how they stand relative to other people. There is that possible issue.
Yes.
And then there are also issues of how this affects the distribution of power within a society. I mean, now that with these super PACs and so on, you could argue that more and more, rich people are calling the shots, so income inequality leads to political inequality. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. There's all kinds of arguments you could make, but...
So my last chapter in the moral arc is called Protopia. So no utopia, no dystopia, just Kevin Kelly's idea of just micro, progressive changes, just little incremental changes, just adjustments here and there, lots of little setbacks all along the way. The arc is bumpy. So I have a discussion of income inequality. It's true, the people that get unearned wealth act like they earned it, and they act nasty to other people. It does cause problems for sure, and it's worthy discussion. It's a worthy discussion. Well, what should we do about it? So I'm not denying any of that. It's just if the overall trend lines are pretty positive in almost every aspect of life, and it's time. It's good to remind ourselves of that fact as we watch the daily news, which is filled with bad news. Of course, that's their job, but the trend lines are positive.
Yeah. Okay. So anything else you want to say about the book? I mean, how are there misconceptions about it you have to keep dispelling, or particular things that people are liking about it? I mean, you've been on the road a couple of weeks now with a book tour. How are things going?
Yep. The reviews have been pretty positive. The reception at talks is fine. I think the objections are the ones you've already brought up. Pretty much every one is valid. These are valid points of discussion. I'm not denying any of them, other than to say, but the bigger picture is what I'm trying to look at here, and that let's continue to do what we've already been doing in applying these reason-based secular ideas from the Enlightenment, because that's what works. And I'm not alone in this. Steven Pinker's Better Angels, Sam Harris, More Landscape, your book, Nonzero, Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist. There's quite a few people that note these trends. And I don't go so far as like Ray Kurzweil, there's this inevitable doubling and the singularity is coming and the utopia is going to be here. I don't go that far. The whole thing could be reversed. It's true. And, ISIL could become an existential threat. I don't think so. Putin is there, but, the likelihood that Putin's going to cobble together a union of Soviet socialist republics on par with what was there in the, say, 60s and 70s, very unlikely. So overall, I'm pretty optimistic.
Do you not worry, as I do, about kind of the pace of change? In other words, this is the flip side of the singularity. The singularity people think, I gather, that change happens faster and faster, things get better and better, and then you reach some point on the other side of which is like nirvana or something. What I would say is, historically, I think societies sometimes have trouble integrating change, especially technological change that redistributes power. I mean, I think that's part of what you're seeing in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, these convulsions. It's like, whoa, the people have power. Oh, no, they're actually being repressed in reaction to the power they have. And you got some pretty bad situations over there that I think are to some extent a product of rapid technological change. Do you not worry about the fact that change seems to be moving faster and faster?
I don't, because I don't think the social change operates at Moore's law speed. Kurzweil has hundreds of these graphs in his books of the whatever we call it, the law of what is it, progressive change or something like that, a geometric growth. Social change really doesn't happen at that speed. It happens gradually, step by step, stepwise, more linear than geometric. Slow enough that we can make adjustments along the way when we don't do things correctly. Mm-hmm. And that, again, that gets back to Locke and Jefferson and these early, I would call scientists, they were called natural philosophers, meant by no one knows, we're too error prone. We don't know how to run a country. We have to set it up where we can constantly adjust it, because errors are going to creep in and problems are going to develop. So I would agree, if it was Moore's law rate of change, then that could lead to disaster. But I don't think that is.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. We will link to the book. A lot of interesting stuff in it, including visual images and graphs. It's a good thing to leaf through. And also, your magazine, The Skeptic, which is a very impressive accomplishment. You started it, and you're a very entrepreneurial guy, aren't you? You started some kind of biking league or something, didn't you?
I did, Race Across America in 1982. Yeah, transcontinental bike race. Yeah, so I do that. I mean, we had corporate sponsors and we had ABC television, and when I started Skeptic magazine, it was just a desire to do something of my own that was intellectually challenging, and it was really just a hobby while I was teaching college. But it got big enough that I didn't need to teach anymore. And I am teaching. The world is a bigger classroom than just a regular classroom. And this is what you do. You're just the different avenues now: social media, blogging, podcast, Twitter. It's endless. The classroom size is limitless, and so I'm still doing what I've always done. Teaching and researching, and working in ideas. All
right. Well, thanks again. Here's the book. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Robert. Appreciate that. That was a good
interview.
Come
back. Certainly, if you write another book, if not before then. And the shorter.
We can do it again. Some other chapters. It's a long book. I have a whole chapter on justice. Retributive justice versus restorative justice. I don't know how closely you followed the restorative justice movement, but it's really quite innovative. Trying to transition these criminals back into society. Instead of treating them moralistically and condemning them and locking them up forever, let's see if we can figure out what the problem is. What's the cause of criminality, and how to fix brains that are broken, or societies that are broken.
I'm in favor of that, and not to harp on this, but that's kind of my issue with the new atheists. I would like to look very carefully at what actually causes what they call religious extremism and respond rationally.
Yep, sure, of course. Any science, rational-based system to solve more social problems and improve things I'm in favor of that.
So we are in complete accord. Excellent. All right.
Sure.
Well, thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks.
All right, bye-bye.